First, an announcement, just to let you know that we hope you can join us next Friday for an exciting election wrap-up program with political experts Elaine Kogan, partner with Kogan, Owens, Kogan, and James Moore, political science professor at the University of Portland and political analyst for Coin Television. That meeting will also be here at the Hilton Hotel in the Rose Ballroom. And now for today's program, which promises to be a most interesting one. Our board host today is Pete Heuser, seated at the end of the table here. He's a partner with Kolish, Hartwell, Dickinson, McCormick, and Heuser, and he will have the privilege of asking the first question of our panel. After Pete's question, we will take questions from City Club audience members. And if you are a member and want to ask a question, please step up to the microphone and ask your question in 30 seconds so that we can have lots of questions from everyone here. Our moderator for today's program, Voting Your Pocketbook, is Morgan Holm. Mr. Holm is a native Oregonian. Most of us have followed and admired his career in Oregon Public Broadcasting, public radio, where he is now radio news producer and editor. I was excited to learn that he participated at one time in the National Spelling Bee. That was in 1980. I hope that he can spell the word palfrey, which is a word that knocked me down on a spelling bee, not nationally. That was at my grade school. He's joined by John Mitchell. John Mitchell is the only member of our panel who has a regular sounding name. The other names are wonderful and unique, and he has a name just kind of like my name. And Mr. Mitchell is Senior Vice President and Chief Economist at U.S. Bank, and he forecasts the economy for his co-workers at the bank and regionally as well. Ed Whitelaw, another wonderful name, is president of Eco Northwest, a regional economics and financial consulting firm. He's also a professor of economics at the University of Oregon and consults nationally. And finally, Bill Lunch, the political analyst for Oregon Public Broadcasting, who is sure, definitely sure, to be totally hoarse by Tuesday night. We all expect to hear much more from him over the weekend and again on Tuesday. Mr. Lunch is also a professor of political science at Oregon State, where he has won many teaching awards. And now it's with great pleasure that I turn this program over to Morgan Holm.
Well, thank you. You're about to hear what I hope is a very interesting discussion about the relationship between next week's election and the economy. I don't want to steal the thunder of this qualified panel you've assembled here to address this, but I thought I could contribute one thing before we start, and that's the media's view of these topics. And it fortunately can be summed up in one sentence, and you'll see why, I think. And it's this. Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago when it was the economy, stupid? 8 years ago when you read his lips and they said no new taxes? 12 years ago when it was morning in America and nobody could find the beef? 16 years ago? Well, you heard I was in the National Spelling Bee 16 years ago, so at the time the school lunch program was higher on my agenda than presidential campaigns, so we'll leave it at that. But you get the idea. For the media, slogans often define the relationship between the economy and the election. Today, I hope these panelists can help you to explore the deeper issues that are really out there and quite prominent in this year's election. So I'm going to turn these guys loose and start out, I think, at the national level. The deficit is down, unemployment is low, inflation is low. So I want to start with our economist. Did Bill Clinton find a secret panel in the Oval Office that had the secret to stimulating the economy, or is Bob Dole sending smoke signals from the Senate? Where is the good news coming from that is sort of the underpinnings of what's happening prior to the election this year? John, let's start with you.
Okay, all right. Well, the National Bureau of Economic Research at Dates Business Cycles says that this upturn started 19 months prior to the last election in March of 1991. We've been growing ever since that point in time. We're in now the 68th month of the upturn. I would argue that if you, abstracting from any sort of individuals or anything, if you wanted to figure out what would be an optimal situation when you were first running for the president, it would be to have the economy coming out of a recession but nobody knew it. And the optimal situation when you were running for your only shot at re-election would be to have low inflation, low unemployment, long-lasting upturn, highly confident consumers, and he's got it. I mean, this is an incumbent's dream.
Ed, when it comes to the state of Oregon, how is this state performing versus the rest of the nation? Is Oregon coming right along with the economic upturn in the rest of the country, doing better? What's happening here?
I think on every one of the measures that John just went through, Oregon's doing better.
Good. Why?
Why? I think the reasons why have nothing to do with anyone in office. So we could, I mean, I was laughing to myself at your saying, nobody really pays attention to the deeper issues of economics during an election campaign. It's because usually they are just sufficient to cure anyone's insomnia if we talk about it at any length. The reasons, most of the reasons are long-term underlying forces driving people to move west and south, having to do with the changing demands in our industrial structure for more highly educated individuals, sort of the luck of location and history for Oregon and the West Coast. I mean, all of those things play into it. And since they are long-term, they have preceded any current tenure and will exceed any current tenure. So the politicians are largely irrelevant to these patterns.
Well, in view of that, which could be a good reason for everyone to leave at this point, give them a reason to stay. Phil, maybe you can make a political connection for us. It may be true that the officials don't contribute to the economy, but they certainly benefit from it.
They certainly do, and I would second John's point about a rosy economy being very helpful to an incumbent. I just checked today's tracking poll from CNN, USA Today, and they have the president up today by 16 points, 51-35, with Perot at 10. And numbers like that are consistently coming out of all the national polling. But if you think about the Northwest region, I would differ marginally with Ed Whitelaw only in this regard. We've been blessed in the Northwest with having some national investments that were put here many years ago. Probably most notably, I'll ask you the question that I ask many of my students early on in a number of my courses: why are the lights lit in this room? And the answer is BPA. And we have the advantage here in the Northwest of exceedingly low electric power rates if you compare our per kilowatt hour rates, for example, to what folks in Boston or New York or Washington, D.C. pay. So even though folks such as Mark Hatfield or in his earlier iterations, Bob Packwood, Al Ullman, now long departed, didn't build the BPA system, they and some others from Washington, Scoop Jackson, Warren Magnuson, kept cheap electric power flowing to the Northwest. And one of the characteristics of this election that has been lost in the hoopla and excitement about who we're going to have next, and perhaps properly so, is that we are losing in the Northwest an inheritance of very substantial seniority in the United States Senate. First, it was in Washington State across the river, and more recently it's been here in Oregon, most notably in Mark Hatfield's chairmanship of the Senate Appropriations Committee, that has protected this region from attempts by others from other parts of the country to significantly raise our industrial costs by privatizing BPA and driving up electric costs double, treble. The economists can tell us how much it would be. But the point of this is that when the dust settles, whether Tom Bruguiere or Gordon Smith ends up as the U.S. Senator from this state, they will not have the seniority to protect the region that we have had literally for decades. And that's an important change in terms of the connection between politics and economics, at least in my view.
Let me pick on another issue that came up in this Congress and may again confront the Congress that seems to have both an economic and political dimension, and that's the balanced budget amendment. First of all, from an economics point of view, what are the pros and cons of requiring the federal government to balance its budget? Does it have some economic ripple effects?
Well, my answer is short. I can think of no pros.
How about some poetry?
Can you, John?
Yes, Ed, I think I can. I believe there are some from the standpoint. Now, I mean, recognizing the accounting is different than the budgeting that companies do, or we might do as individuals. But from the standpoint of sort of being aware of what government costs directly, I think there might be some points to be made for that. To the extent that there is a crowding out problem, which is a matter of some dispute, to the extent that the budget deficit crowds out private capital formation, there may be long-run costs in terms of productivity performance. But I mean, I agree with Ed in the sense that we have to be careful of the notion that this is some kind of a panacea and then everything's going to be okay. We have to remember, I mean, that's the difference between two, much larger numbers. I think it's perhaps more important to worry about the spending side.
So, Bill, when this comes up in Congress, if it doesn't seem like there are such great advantages, why does it continually prove to be such a divisive issue and one that comes up in terms of the election?
We've been running a very large budget deficit following the tax cuts that were enacted by Congress in 1981 as part of Ronald Reagan's economic changes. Essentially, from the point of view of understanding the deficit, what we did in the early 80s was to significantly cut taxes on the highest earners, the wealthiest people in the country. And at the same time, while there were some marginal reductions in spending, they really were marginal. And so under Reagan, deficits ballooned up into the $200 and then $300 million range. By the time we got to the end of the Bush administration, following much the same kinds of policies, the budget deficit was getting into the $400 million range. And
if I billions.
Yeah, did I say million? Pardon me. A billion is 1,000 millions, so there's a slight difference there. I apologize for the error. Billion with a B. Anyway, at that time, when the budget deficits were up in the 400 billion range or close to that, as I recall, economists such as Ed and John were not thrilled about the prospects that were confronting the national economy from that in terms of crowding out private investment and driving up interest rates, a variety of those kinds of things. The Clinton administration has marginally raised rates on the highest earners, the wealthier folks in the economy, not nearly as much as they were reduced in the early 80s, but somewhat. The economy has been relatively healthy. The deficit is now about half, in fact, a little less than half of what it was at the beginning of Clinton's term. Now the question arises whether Congress will move forward to eliminate the last approximately 100 to 150 billion in the deficit. You will recall, back to Mark Hatfield cast the decisive vote in the U.S. Senate when this matter came up at the beginning of the 104th Congress in 1995 to prevent the balanced budget amendment from passing Congress. Remember, it needs a 2/3 vote, and going out to the states. Its fate in the states is, if it should get there, is not clear. But the point is that Mark Hatfield will be gone, not only for Oregon, but in a certain sense for the country, as of 1997. And so my own view is that the prospects for a balanced budget amendment as a symbolic matter, whatever its economic effects, being passed by Congress are probably greater in the 105th Congress, the one that we're about to elect here, than they were in the 104th Congress. That may be economically a bad idea, but symbolically, Americans say by 3/4, sometimes 4/5 margin, they want a balanced budget. They don't necessarily understand the economic impacts, but symbolically it sounds like a good idea to them.
Let me just clarify one thing. I took Morgan's question to ask pros and cons of a balanced budget amendment. I can think of no pros for that. That is different than saying I can imagine conditions under which balancing a budget might be a good thing. But that's sort of a world of difference in those two.
Can I just
Go
just
ahead,
a
John.
couple things?
You
I
look
guess
troubled.
I would disagree a little bit with what Bill said. To say that, for example, that the Bush fiscal policies were the same as the Reagan fiscal policies, I would argue that the Bush fiscal policies were the same as the Clinton fiscal policies. I mean, in the sense of raising marginal or raising taxes on high-income individuals. And the notion, and the other thing, I mean, you talked about cuts in taxes. The 1981 Tax Act was, like the Dole proposal, it was reductions in marginal tax rates. And if you look at what happened afterwards, I mean, tax revenues accelerated, and the taxes paid by high-income individuals went up significantly and accounted for a much larger share of the taxes paid.
Having said that, the consequence of those changes in the tax code, combined with, I want to be fair, combined with a substantial acceleration in defense spending. The Reagan administration doubled spending on defense in a matter of about 2-3 years. So combined with a change in the tax code, which, depending on your point of view, had revenue effects which can be argued about, but nonetheless, at sort of, I think, a level of some agreement, certainly the amount of revenue being received by the federal government did not notably increase while we were increasing defense expenditures very substantially. And so you cannot both raise the defense budget, cut marginal tax rates, and balance the budget. You can do any two of those things, but you can't do all three at once.
Well, that does, again, get back to an issue that has been raised in the presidential campaign. Bob Dole, a while back, proposed a 15% tax cut, and you'll notice he spends less time talking about that now and more time talking about foreign campaign contributions.
Right.
First of all, how realistic is the idea of a 15% tax cut?
To whom?
Yeah.
Politically, people who are voting for Bob Dole or Bill Clinton, or Ross Perot.
They don't appear to be very realistic. I think Mario Cuomo had the greatest line about that when he characterized Dole's proposal as deja voodoo all over again.
Yeah.
I don't know that it's, if you're saying how realistic are its prospects, I would say not very realistic at all.
How workable is it?
Oh,
story.
I think I want to bait John. Do you think it's workable, John?
It might be. If you look at the whole package, I mean, not just that you had a 15% reduction in marginal tax rates, reduction in capital gains taxes, expanded IRAs, and then a list of sort of spending cuts, some of which are unspecified. And I must admit, that kind of stuff I have a lot of trouble with. I mean, presumably they were going to have the balanced budget achievement with these specified spending cuts, of course, exempting Medicare and Social Security. And I'm real skeptical of that. I think there's a question raised by that Dole proposal that really hasn't gotten much interest, and I suspect because people feel pretty good, in the sense of can we do better? The administration, can point to very justifiably that, the strong numbers that you've got now, and Dole can equally correctly say, gee, it's one of the weakest upturns we've ever had, and they're both right. And so, I mean, is there I think there's a legitimate question, could our growth performance be better than the 2.5%? I mean, that seems to be an implicit Federal Reserve target. I think that's a serious question. I mean, can we do things that would get productivity higher? But the question hasn't caught on.
Well, but why isn't the 15% tax cut catching fire among people? Why isn't Bob Dole getting more mileage out of it?
The answer is that when folks are polled, we have public opinion data on this, and they're asked about the Dole 15% tax cut plan, but it depends on which poll, which set of folks you ask just a little bit, but between 2/3 and 3/4 of the American people don't believe it. That is to say, they don't believe either A, that it'll be enacted by Congress, or B, that if it is enacted, it would be in a form that would benefit them. The most common response among most voters to this proposal is to say that it's a campaign ploy. That is to say, they do not view it as a serious proposal. Now, that may in part be a function of Dole's background. Dole in his entire congressional career up until the moment of conversion when he got the Republican nomination, has been a deficit hawk. That is to say, he's been pushing ever since the early 80s to try and get the deficit down, and has been a friend, excuse me, of folks such as the Concord Coalition, for whom this is sort of the holy grail. And so now he has either a deathbed or born-again conversion, take your pick, and decides that he's in favor of a 15% tax cut. I'm not surprised that large numbers of the American people would be skeptical about the sincerity of such a proposal, but that's what we're getting out of the public opinion numbers. People just don't believe it.
Let's narrow our focus now and talk about some things that are more germane to us here in Oregon in particular. I'd like you, first of all, to assume that something more than 50% of the voters on Tuesday say yes to Measure 47, the property tax cut and cap measure. What sort of effects does that have on the economics of the state, how governments can carry out their services, their responsibilities? How does that affect individuals?
I can't imagine a Measure 47 world without a substantial decrease in the investment in education. I also cannot imagine productivity in Oregon or our growth to the extent it depends on human capital and our resources not suffering from any decrease in that investment in education, which is not to say we might not do it, just as friends might commit suicide, but I regard it as singularly myopic.
We were sort of bailed out last time as a state. I mean, Measure 5 was imposed, and there were a number, lots of predictions, many of which did not come true. We had a number of things that happened that enabled the funding to be there to make up many, but not all, the shortfalls and the like. You had the period of very strong growth that we've talked about earlier, and Oregon's revenue structure is essentially driven by income tax receipts and 5 machines in a bar. We had very rapid increases in lottery revenues, okay? And we had the rapid increases in assessed values that reflect the underlying strength of the real estate market. I suspect that we would not be so fortunate as to be bailed out again by that process. Certainly the assessment process wouldn't do it because of the provisions of Measure 47. Not likely we'll see the same kind of growth in the lottery kinds of things. And I agree with Ed. I think there's a very a serious risk for the state to enable us to deal with long-term kinds of issues. We've had rapid growth, we've got transportation problems, that kind of stuff. This would force us once again to focus on short-term kinds of things, coping with an immediate crisis rather than long-term problems.
Would it, though, put brakes on the economy in some sense? Or?
Over time.
How so?
Well, to the extent that you have deterioration in infrastructure, weakness in education, I think over the long term, that would be a braking factor.
And one of the difficulties is over the long term, we will have forgotten what it is that precipitated it. I mean, that's the decoupling between short-term and long-term memory for collective decision-making is enough to cripple Oregon's economy, not to mention the education of so many of our young people.
Bill, you watched after Measure 5 was passed. Right. You watched the legislature backfill that as they were required to do by the measure to make up the funding that would have disappeared from education.
Yep. To some degree.
If Measure 47 passes, there is no such requirement in the measure, as I understand it.
That's right.
So what would be the political forces at work to try to keep the ship of state on an even keel, as it were?
Well, let me back up. I'll answer that, but I want to back up one step. If you think about Oregon's economy, not to take away from what Ed or John have said, we've made an extraordinary shift in the last 12 to 15 years. Just before the program began, Pete Heiser and I were talking about this. We've moved from an economy in the state which is natural resource or was natural resource based, things such as timber and mining and agriculture, to an economy being driven by a post-industrial sector, high tech in particular. So we've gone from a phase 1 economy to a phase 3 degree in sort of one leap. And that underlying transformation of the state's economy, at least those parts of it which are expanding rapidly, and on the other side contracting, has made for some very difficult kinds of circumstances for folks. The pressure for property tax limitation really grows out of this transformation of the economy. To come to Morgan's question, however, you will recall that the property tax limit passed in 1990, known popularly as Measure 5. I try to avoid that nomenclature because we've had a lot of other Measure 5 since. But the property tax limit approved in November of 1990 included an explicit provision requiring the state legislature to some degree, not entirely, to backfill with income tax funds the lost property tax revenue that school districts and to a lesser degree local governments would lose under the measure. This Measure 47 does not include any of those backfilling provisions, and I think it's worth noting that the sponsors of this measure early on in the campaign, in the summer, after the measure had qualified for the ballot, but before the real campaign had begun, were fairly explicit in saying that they thought it was a good thing if the schools took a hit. The chief petitioner for the measure, Bill Sizemore, said at that time, he's not saying this anymore, but at that time he said, this is almost a direct quote, I'm paraphrasing him, but only a little, this is ultimately going to boil down to a debate over schools. Do they have enough money? We think they've got plenty. And the subtext is plenty to take a further budget reduction. We've been cutting budgets for schools, particularly in the urban. Now, this is not true in rural places where the schools were underfunded, because under the school equalization formula that the legislature has enacted since 1991, there are some school districts in the state which are actually doing better than they were in 1991. But for urban school districts such as the ones in Portland or Eugene or Corvallis, where I'm from, we've been cutting school budgets for 5-6 years now. If Measure 47 passes, we will have to cut school budgets in the neighborhood of 15 to 20% further beyond what we've already done. The average size of an elementary school classroom in terms of kids in the classroom now, I am told by the school people, is in the neighborhood of 30 to 31 kids. Do simple math. If it's a 20% cut, you got 30 kids in the classroom, now you're going to have 36 when this is done.
But what about the two things that John mentioned, income taxes and the lottery? Is there a way to employ those tools to make up the shortfall, as the supporters of Measure 47 claim could be done? How wise is it? Let me start with the lottery. How wise is it to figure that into the state's economic picture and what can be done to meet the needs of the state?
Well, I mean, you already had Ted Kulongowski's the commission on studying the gambling, trying to think through what the sort of the social implications are. Now you've got, I believe, 9 Indian casinos. There's that sort of competition is there. It's fascinating if you think we have this notion of we have the highest marginal income tax rates in the country at the lowest level of income as our principal source of state revenue, and then the other thing is video poker. I mean, it's an interesting juxtaposition. Do we want to go to 10 machines in a bar or state casinos? I suspect probably not. And I really have to wonder on the income tax side, how much higher, can you push it? I know if you look at total collections, we're about in the middle, but when you get individual taxes that have rates that are sort of out of line with averages, you have to put the possibility for distortions, and we have to remember that at least in this room, we border on a place with a zero marginal income tax rate.
Ed?
Well, it's hard to, it's a little like waterbed debate in the sense that if I push on one element on which the arguments for Measure 47 seem to rely, the response pops up somewhere else. That is, it seemed to be a variety of responses. A, no, there really won't be a reduction in total revenues because we'll make it up with income taxes and lottery funds. B, even if it does have an impact on reduction in revenues for education, it really won't affect it because we've got a lot of extra money in the school systems. Or C, if we actually reduce the expenditures on education, it really doesn't affect the economy anyway. I mean, it doesn't work. It turns out I think the last part of that is wrong, and then I think the next part is wrong. I think each of those is wrong, but in a 30-second slot or on a bumper sticker, you get only one of those responses. Unfortunately, I think that's the extent of the substance of the debate we've had on it where it matters.
Well, whether the measure passes or not, it seems that the state legislature is going to have to confront to either a greater or lesser degree the state's taxation system and where the money comes from. Right. Bill, in the election next Tuesday, what are the possible outcomes that will start to shape that debate starting in January?
Well, the first outcome is one that isn't on the ballot. We elected a governor 2 years ago, John Kitzhaber, who said at the time of his election that he anticipated working on revision of the state's tax code during his first term, but probably not the first half. So Governor Kitzhaber has signaled pretty strongly that he expects to present to the 1997 legislature a tax revision package. Now, if Measure 47 passes, then this will be done with the gun to the head of numerous first-grade teachers in the state of Oregon. If Measure 47 fails, the debate may be a little less frenzied or crisis-driven. But I think that the governor has made it pretty clear that he anticipates that there'll be a major package before the legislature from his commission that's working on this during the 97 session. Now, within the legislative elections, the current lineup of the state Senate is 19-11 Republican. Even if this turns out to be as Democratic a year as it looks as it may be, the Democrats might pick up 1 or 2 seats in the state Senate, but they're not going to gain control. So the Republicans will have control of the state Senate. The state House is much more at play. The Republicans currently have 34 seats, the Democrats 26, so if the Democrats pick up as few as 5 seats, which is in the realm of what's possible, then they'll have control of the state House. In either event, whether the House stays Republican or goes Democratic, you're going to have a Democratic governor, at least one House of the state legislature under Republican control. So there's going to have to be some bipartisanship in order to move any kind of a package to change the state's tax code. The prospects for that, I can only refer you back to Barbara Roberts' conversation with Oregon in 1991 and 92. Good luck, folks.
Well, we've had an opportunity to talk about some of these economic issues at the national level and the state level, and I've been asking all the questions, so I'd like to give you the opportunity to pick the brains, and I think we're going to start here with Pete Heuser with the first question today.
I'd like to get back to the federal deficit. Ed, I think you indicated that from the economy's standpoint, it didn't really matter who was in office, but let's assume that it does matter as far as spending and the deficit is concerned as to who is in office. Let's just assume that President Clinton wins. But let's look as far as spending and the deficit in particular. What difference will it make whether the House turns Democrat or remains Republican, Congress? So let's say it's a Republican Congress. Are they going to be able to rein in the spending during a second Clinton administration? If it's a Democratic Congress, are they going to be able to cut back on defense spending sufficiently to make a difference in the deficit? Can you give us your thoughts on that?
Well, I think, take the first condition. If the Republicans retain control, will they succeed in reining in the spending? Clinton, if nothing else, is eminently malleable. And so I have no doubt that we will get very modest, if any, changes from the current circumstances. But in these discussions of the deficit, it's always at this point that I start remembering something my dad, who was very conservative, would always say about borrowing. And I was always struck by the first time I came in and said I borrowed a large amount of money. He did not say that was stupid. He said, what did you spend it on? So the notion of the deficit per se, at least to me and the training I've had, is irrelevant. That is, what have we spent the money on? So if you decouple, again that word, if you decouple the deficit spending from what it is you've spent it on, then you've begged the question of, impacts on growth, for example. Did you invest it? Did you consume it? You know, those kinds of questions. So again, the discussion, and I'm not going to pretend we're going to get into an economic discourse on this, but if we are going to go from bumper stickers to substance, then I think it requires a conversation in which both those topics are addressed with responsibility and integrity, and not during the silly season. So, you know, I appreciate it's the silly season that brought us all together today. On the other hand, I think, at least at some point, we face up to this issue of, well, what'd you spend the money on? It's not the deficit per se. It's what is it? Education? Is it, I don't know, roads? Is it armaments? Those kinds of questions.
I mean, I agree with what Ed said. I think what's going to be interesting after the election, and I think we got a taste of it perhaps in the second presidential debate when, you know, this entitlements question is going to be perhaps back to the fore because you're going to have an administration that's not facing re-election. Perhaps the Kerry Danforth report that got buried in 1994 might be dusted off. But you've seen the way people have been trying to beat up each other on this, on the Medicare thing, and you know, there's a problem. I mean, there's an underlying demographic problem that has to be faced, and you know, sort of the sooner you can take sort of marginal actions now, it can have major payoffs down the road. I think we may start down that path.
I actually apologize, Pete, though I have done what all the other, what the politicians have been doing this season. You posed a question, and I managed to scoot off on some other topic. I addressed only the first half, and fortunately, my short-term memory.
Well, let's say the Congress goes Democratic. How is that going to change things?
Yeah, I mean, Bill, I'm sure, is prepared to address the politics. Let me do it from my amateur perspective. I don't think it's going to change much. That is, I don't think we're going to get enormous majorities of Democrats in either house. And therefore, I think, except for a few key chairs, there won't be much difference next year from this year with slight Democratic majorities in the houses.
Yeah, that's correct. Ed's right. The best nose counters in official Washington, particularly a guy named Charlie Cook, who really has an extraordinarily good track record in this, say that either the Democrats will retake control with, say, 3 or 4 seats to spare, very, very narrow majority, or the Republicans will retain control with 3 or 4 seats to spare. So clearly the Democrats are going to gain in the House. It's not quite clear if they'll gain just enough to regain control. That makes a big difference in terms of the agenda of the committees, by the way, but that's another topic for another day. In the Senate, similarly, the best nose counters now expect the Senate to end up either, currently is 53 Republicans and 47 Democrats. The best nose counters expect the Senate to end up either 51 Republicans and 49 Democrats, a net Democratic gain of 2, or, most interesting possibility in a certain sense, 50-50, in which case Al Gore cast the deciding vote, because those of you who have read your Constitution carefully will recall that the Vice President is technically the presiding officer in the Senate. He doesn't exercise that power very often, because if he tried to do it, the Senate would revolt against the Vice President. But in a situation in which the Senate is literally knotted up at 50-50, which could happen as a result of the Senate races which are up around the country, then the Vice President would essentially elect Democratic chairmen for a variety of committees. As I say, the committee chairmanships are very, very important, as I'm sure Bob Smith, who's running out in the 2nd District, is very well aware, because as you know, he has a letter in his hip pocket from Newt Gingrich promising him the chairmanship of the House Agriculture Committee if the Republicans retain their majority. I think there may be a sort of a muse, sort of like, remember the cartoon character Joe Potolsvik, who had the cloud over him from the old days on the funny pages, following Bob Smith around, because I have this sneaking suspicion that he's going to win re-election or election in the 2nd District. The Republicans are going to lose their majority, and he'll be the ranking member on agriculture. But that's just a guess.
Go ahead.
Let me ask just one quick follow-up question I think that goes nicely with this, what you're talking about. In the event Bill Clinton, though, does win re-election, He's a lame duck president, in essence. Does he have any power to somehow set an agenda if there is a Republican Senate or a Republican Senate and House, and try to leave some sort of presidential legacy, whether it's economic or otherwise?
One of the great mysteries of our political system from the very beginning, in a certain sense, is we elect our Congresses and our presidents separately. As an institutional matter, they have no reason to get along with one another, and frequently, as you know, they don't. But if we had a parliamentary system, it would be a very different ballgame indeed. But we don't. We structured this system. The ghost of James Madison is in the room today because he's really the author of the Constitution in most of its respects. And he structured a system to make it difficult for action to occur. He could never have, well, he was a very bright guy. He, I don't think, would have guessed that we'd end up in a situation such as we have now, in which you've got a president of one party in control, conceivably one house, the other party of the other house. But this is, above all else, a recipe for deadlock. And under those circumstances, whether a president who's in the party that's not fully in control of Congress can move anything, my guess is that we're in for, as Ed and John have suggested in terms of economic policy, we're in for status quo, whatever that is, good or ill, because not very much is going to move, at least in the next 2 years.
Go ahead.
Steve Burdick, City Club member. In the arena of international trade, and maybe more specifically in the high-tech segment of international trade, and presuming President Clinton retains a 16% lead, what is likely to happen in that arena, and what are the implications for Oregon, and do the electorate have any chance in this election to affect that?
Yeah, we're still following through, of course. I mean, with the implementation of GATT and NAFTA, World Trade Organization is making rulings. There may be some expansion. There've been proposals over time to add people to, or add countries to the NAFTA agreement. I don't sense that as a major issue at the moment. I mean, a lot of impetus to go off in that direction. You may not see much in the way of change there. I mean, we've had the trade agreements implemented, and we'll probably just let those work out. I don't see a lot of a notion to expand them right now.
Ray Plani, a City Club member. As a retired mortgage debt servicer, I have a nagging question that keeps bothering me all the time, and that is why all the emphasis on the deficit and so little attention to the debt itself, which causes interest and causes deficit and is being compounded if you don't start paying off on the principal, on the debt itself. 5 trillion, I guess, something like that.
I'm just sad Bill Vickery died. William Vickery just received the Nobel Prize in economics, and he died 3 days later. I think those are unrelated events. And he, throughout his lifetime, has been a proponent of the view that not only should we ignore the deficit, but the debt as well. From that pulpit that the Nobel gives some economists, it would have been a lively debate, and it would have been fun joining in the fray. John, however, though, I think can give us at least some of the insights of why the financial markets might be upset.
Well, I mean, the deficit has come down substantially. Last year, 107 billion and change. The debt has been much higher relative to gross domestic product than it is right now. In 1946, it was about 120. I don't remember this. I read about it. But in 1946, it was about 126% of gross domestic product. You're now down in the 60, 70% range. If you get the deficit small or zero, then what happens is the economy continues to grow. The debt becomes much smaller relative to the economy, which is what we did after the Second World War. And I mean, I'll be honest with you, it's not something I really lose a lot of sleep over.
Dan Golding, member. I've got a whole smorgasbord of questions I'd like to ask you, but I'm going to stick to one because I think this one is the one that's most likely to be enacted in the new Congress, and that is the constitutional amendment to balance the budget. I think this time it's likely to go through because of the symbolism. And I got 3 questions to ask you about it. One, when people say, why can't the federal government do it, the states do it, people don't understand that the state doesn't balance the capital budget, only the operating budget, and the capital budget is thrown into the constitutional amendment. And my question to you is, if you tried to balance the whole budget, all the infrastructure investments as well, wouldn't you put the economy in the tank? Phase 2, what would you bankers do, John, if we, in effect, didn't run any deficits, we didn't issue any government bonds, and it's the bonds that provide the liquidity for the banks, insurance companies, and our financial institutions? And number 3, in the constitutional amendment, they have got very rigid provisions that make it very difficult to respond if the national economy goes into recession or depression. So in relation to those, I'd like to ask you now what you think of the constitutional amendment to balance the budget.
I'll handle 1 and 3, and John can handle 2. The answer to your number 1 question, would it go into the tank? The answer is yes. And it's in large part because the answer to number 3 is yes as well. It would eliminate fiscal policy, but it would also eliminate the investment strategies. And so only the second now remains, since I've left with irrefutable logic answers to your first and third questions. And so, John, what would the bankers do?
Well, Ed, you've got that about $4 or $5 trillion stuff that's still out there that can be traded and held as for example, I don't know where Dan went. That could be traded and held as assets. I mean, you don't just have to hold new stuff. You got all that other stuff out there, and assuming you balance the budget, you still have that outstanding debt that's tradable assets that could furnish that.
Well, and the rest of the world.
Is there?
Yeah.
Yes. Well, what is the effect on sort of consumer confidence or governmental confidence with and without a balanced budget amendment? Does it matter to people who are watching the government whether it really is mandated?
Well, consumer confidence is pretty high now, and it's not balanced. I mean, you go back to 1969, which was the last time that there was a balanced budget. I think it's something that people are fascinated by in the abstract, and then when it comes down to specifics, it gets a little more questionable.
I mean, actually, the question should go the other way. Why are voters, so fascinated with the deficit? Economists find it a yawner most of the time. So,
well, the answer is because it's a symbolic representation of people's economic anxieties. And as we've been going through this economic transformation that really has been national in scope, but has been particularly pointed here in the Northwest, if you think back to 1992, when Ross Perot was riding the deficit horse very hard and got 24% of the vote here in the state of Oregon, and a figure almost as high in the state of Washington, what was it about his anti-deficit message that resonated so much better with people in 92 than it is this year? The answer is that people were in at least a perception. John Mitchell points out the statistics belie this, but the perception was we were in a fairly deep recession, that it was not getting better. People's personal circumstances were very anxiety-producing in many cases. Some of you have seen the series of articles the New York Times did on the downsizing of America. That reflects a great deal of fear and anxiety, even on the part of people who've got jobs and are going to keep them. They're fearful that they're going to lose them. The deficit is a symbol for most people. It doesn't have much to do with a deep understanding of economics. There's pretty good evidence in public opinion polling that people don't have that understanding. But it's a symbol for their economic anxieties.
well, but, okay, and then, so let's say we educated everybody. Would they simply glom onto some other symbol equally irrelevant to their daily lives? And I think the answer is yes. So why spend time having these discussions about the deficit? I'm only about 30% facetious.
Spoken like a true economist.
Andrew Kaiser, City Club member. By my read, our society can be divided into three groups with respect to Medicare and Social Security. Those who are getting it and want to keep getting it, those who believe it will never be there, and then those of us in the third group, myself included, who think 28 years from now there will be something for me to collect. My belief is that we're going to have huge, huge problems with this issue in the very near future. What do you see as any likelihood of something being enacted in the next presidential term?
Let me take a shot at this. I'm not the economist on this panel, but this question is in some sense political. If you were, let me give you a simple change. Let's not say easy, but a simple change. As I understand it, and the two economists here can correct me if I'm wrong, if we were to slice 1% off of the cost of living adjustment for Social Security for each of the out years, in other words, starting in the next fiscal year to come, so that you basically, if the inflation rate is 4%, you give people a 3% increase who are getting Social Security, you would, by that single change, just about solve your long-term problem with Social Security funding. This is not a problem that the programs are, in a profound sense, bound to go under. It is rather that we have laden them down with too much expectation. And there are some small tinkering changes which can be made now around the edges of these programs, if they're made in the next few years, that would avoid huge problems that your question implies in, say, the year 2015 or 2020.
But I think, let's see, I think none of us can predict the chances that something will be enacted,
right,
which was your question. I think all of us can agree that the chances are zero that any solution will be enacted during the next session or presidential term or whatever. If something is enacted, and I'm sure there will be things enacted over the years, we will stumble eventually to a fix. And whether we will regard it as any kind of optimal solution or not, I'm sure we won't, but we will sort of stumble our way through that problem, since it's unlikely to bring us down. It will sure harass us, however. So.
We've already actually sort of been through a process where we have taken some steps similar to the kind of steps that I think are very likely ultimately going to have to be taken. You've already seen an increase in the retirement age that came out of the early 80s bipartisan commission on Social Security. That could be done again, edging that up further. We've already taken steps to tax, and increase the fraction of Social Security income that is taxed, which you get back everything you ever put in a couple of years, so that can would certainly make some sense. There will be the very likely intellectual support with the commission that is studying the consumer price index that may give you a cover saying, okay, this overstates inflation, and then you'll have a potentially, perhaps the right political mix in the sense of a second term, and we are still in what I think one would have to regard as a golden age demographically, because the wave of retirees is not there yet, and it's not coming till after the turn of the century.
Well, that was good. I like that. That was a much better answer.
He was one of my teachers.
I'm Arnold Kogan, member of the club. Can you translate some of the rhetoric coming from the two presidential campaigns? The Clinton campaign is saying the economy is good and getting better. The Dole campaign says that the economy is bad and we need to get it moving again. And I'm more puzzled by what is it that Dole and the Dole campaign is actually talking about when they say that we have to get America moving again economically, because all the indicators seem to show that it is moving well. Can you translate that political speak from the Dole campaign on the economic these economic issues that are being talked about?
Yeah, I think so, in the sense that, you look at like Arthur Oaken's misery index, inflation and unemployment, it's at the lowest level in 25 years. 27. Those numbers look very strong. But if you look at this particular upturn compared to other upturns in the post-World War II time period, it has been amongst the slowest, and there is only one upturn that we've had that has had slower growth in disposable income.
But the Federal Reserve then says we want it at that slow level. As long as it's up, it's slow enough that we don't have to raise interest rates. Inflation isn't going to be a problem.
Right. That's the question you asked. I mean, I'm just trying to reconcile the two different. You could look at those different indicators and make those, statements.
I think economists in general pay too little attention to the role equity or perceptions of inequity play in feelings of unease and the like. It's just ironic. I mean, I think where I find some truth in Dole's dismal observations, lamentations, is not what he has identified, but that he has identified some problems, and I think they stem mainly from concerns of unfairness, inequity, and the like in the distributions of whatever growth we're getting, whether it's slow or fast. And I believe this to be true. I don't know it to be true, that as inequity increases, as the gap between the rich and the poor, or the average and the median household incomes increase, that causes problems, and it manifests itself in various ways: insecurity, anxieties, civil uncivility, the loss of comity, those kinds of things.
So I think you make a good point. Is Bob Dole's campaign really criticizing Bill Clinton's management of the economy, or is he criticizing Alan Greenspan and the Fed for keeping things maybe more of a lid on the economy than they could?
Or the Republicans' past policies.
Well, I need to interrupt and thank on your behalf with great enthusiasm this tremendously well-informed and informative panel. Morgan Holm, Ed Whitelaw, John Mitchell, and Bill Lunch. I've learned a tremendous amount. I think we all know how important it is that we vote on Tuesday. I personally intend to take my MasterCard and put it in debt up to the hilt and increase my annual gift to the City Club by many-fold, a highly worthy organization. Thank you for your attention. We're adjourned.